Feel like my brother's gone. A life is gone. He's never coming back. So in a sense, I feel life for life. You took his life. I feel like you should spend the rest of yours behind bars.
They observe him, walk up behind him, and shoot him once in the head. And he did this motion to them as he walked past, as if to suggest, shh.
This reeked of revenge.
How do you walk past the site where your brother was murdered? How do you move on from something that is in your face every single day?
He told Saquon, whenever I see you, I'm just gonna handle the situation.
My grandmother used to always say, you try to dig a ditch for someone else that you're gonna fall in.
2016, in the sprawling suburbs of Northern Virginia. After a late night out, 22-year-old Kentrice Hall is getting ready for bed when she's interrupted by a terrifying call.
I literally just took my dress off and laid in the bed. I was so tired. I was on the phone, and I keep getting this call from this guy. I know he likes me, and he's from, uptown. And I'm like, what do he want? So I finally answered the phone, maybe the third call, and he's like, your brother, he just got shot. I'm like, what? Like, I immediately jumped up, and I'm telling my mom, like, get the F up. Like, Saquon has been shot. We have to go now.
When Kentrice told me that, I just freaked out. It was like one of my worst fears coming to fruition. I don't change clothes or anything. We both get in the car and we're on our way.
The pair head to the place where the shooting occurred.
I did maybe 80 all the way down the street. I put the hazards on, so I was able to fly.
Kentrice's brother, 23-year-old Saquon Hall, has gotten into his share of trouble before. But this time, it feels different.
When I get there, the whole street is lit up. A lot of people standing outside. There's paramedics.
And I'm running up the street saying, where's my son? He wasn't in the ambulance. They were, I think, putting him on the stretcher. But everything seemed like it was in slow motion. I'm praying, I'm hollering, Saquon, hold on.
Saquon Hall was born on November 7th, 1992. And he and his 4 siblings grew up in a low-income Northern Virginia neighborhood.
The 3 oldest boys are actually 5 years apart. And then there was Saquon.
Me and Saquon are very close in age. You couldn't tell if we weren't twins growing up. My mom would buy us 2 of the same shoes, just different sizes. He was always the person in the grade before me, so everyone knew that I was coming.
He was always cutting up in school. He was just a class clown. Everybody loved him. He was a good guy.
Saquon's aunts and uncles lived on the same block, so he was always surrounded by family. But Saquon had a special relationship with his father.
He liked to play football a lot, and Saquon's dad was his football coach. Saquon was a really good player, very fast, light on his feet.
When his father died, Saquon was only 8 years old. It turned his entire world upside down.
Once his dad died, it was just like, no more football. Like, he would watch the Cowboys, of course, but he didn't want to play anymore.
It's very difficult when children lose a parent. Very difficult. And for Saquon, he didn't have a strong male role model in his life.
As he grew older, Saquon became his own role model, taking care of his mother and sister, as well as his close friends.
He was very much outspoken. He let you know, if there was any injustice or wrong, he would say it.
You come to him with a problem, he made it his problem. One time, I think I was in the 6th grade, Saquon was in the 7th grade, and we were walking across our middle school football field to get to my mom's job. And all of a sudden, you see Saquon's friend getting like body slammed by a police officer, and Saquon being the person that he is, like he ran over there, to like diffuse the situation. They started to, of course, body slam Saquon as well. And I'm standing there looking like, what? I'm just like screaming. They took him down to the police station and all that. And that was Saquon's very first, incident with the law.
As a result, Saquon's mother decided to relocate the family to a different area of town.
My mom was like, I'm done with it. We're moving from the projects, we're moving to the west side, and it's gonna be a better life for everyone.
But for Saquon, it was hard adjusting to a new neighborhood.
The first 2 or 3 months, he was catching the bus and would be gone all day in our old neighborhood.
I would have to go looking for him to find out where he was. I just didn't like the crowd that he was hanging with.
Saquon began spending more and more time on the streets. To keep him out of trouble, his mother encouraged him to volunteer at a local soup kitchen.
I'm a minister, and I was an advocate helping those in public housing. My children were always there with me to help me clean up. I tried to raise my kids with how to be proactive, and just love everybody.
But it was a high school classmate who finally got Saquon to settle down. Her name was Takia Johnson. And not long after graduation, she and Saquon had a child together.
He was 19 or 20 when the kids came. Well, when the first child came, which was a girl. Loved her.
Things started to definitely change. Everything was about Skylar and this and Skylar that. I know that definitely brought a different side to him. And then slowly after that, Imari came, and then it was like a dad of 2, and it was just like, what are you gonna do?
Then, in 2015, Saquon's turn at fatherhood nearly came to an end when he was shot for the first time.
I remember it's kind of cold, late at night, and we got a call saying that he was shot. So we, of course, immediately ran to the hospital. And there was detectives there trying to hound him to see who shot him.
He wouldn't say a word. He wouldn't say anything. I figured he was trying to honor the street code.
Saquon's loved ones hoped the brush with death would slow him down. In the weeks since the shooting, Saquon was focusing on his family and talked about going back to school to become an HVAC repairman.
I could tell he wanted to be like a fun dad. All of that long nights going out and stuff like that, he definitely changed.
But now, a second shooting has left Saquon fighting for his life. And his mother finds herself praying, once again, for his recovery.
As they were taking Saquon to the hospital, she rode in the back. And the whole time that she was riding with him, she was thinking, maybe this is just another minor shooting. Maybe he'll get through this.
As the ambulance speeds away, police begin their investigation.
Crime scene investigators responded, of course, and processed the crime scene. They found multiple shell casings, I believe 16 shell casings, all of which were from a 9mm.
There were shell casings found up and down First Street. You can see that the shooter was not standing in the same place while he was shooting.
Police recovered 2 revolvers nearby. Neither of them matches the 9mm shell casings at the scene, due to one clear explanation.
A semi-automatic weapon will kick out the shell casings. When you fire a revolver, the shell casing remains in the gun.
It was unclear to us if those weapons were ever discharged that night.
To a detective, it says that there were other guns on the scene. It could have been somebody else. It could have been the shooter having more than one gun. Who had it? Who was shooting is what the investigation reveals.
As 23-year-old Saquon Hall is rushed to a Northern Virginia hospital in critical condition, investigators question witnesses at the scene. His sister, Kentrice Hall, tells detectives they'd spent the night hosting an event together.
The night of July 1st, we had a big party. We had like a celebrity guest come. Me, Saquon, and a bunch of our friends worked very hard selling tickets for the event. But that night, it was like really weird. I mean, he was very standoffish. You could tell that he was like watching what was going on around him, or like he just wasn't there.
The party ended around midnight, and Kentrice headed home. But Saquon wasn't quite ready to call it a night.
Saquon had said he was going, with his friends. So they went uptown to the projects where one of his friends lived.
They all returned to someone's house to kind of continue hanging out. There was a large group of people who went back there.
According to Saquon's friends, the attack took place shortly after they got to the house. They'd had a few drinks when Saquon suddenly decided to leave with two young women.
At some point there, he left the residence where he was with two individuals in a car, drove a short way away. He gets out of the car. The two female individuals remained in the car. Shortly thereafter, there was a lot of gunfire.
The women say they saw Saquon running back toward the car seconds later.
Saquon was trying to escape from somebody who was pursuing him, and then one shot hit him and he fell to the ground. While he was down on the ground, the person pursuing him came up from behind and shot him again.
He was shot twice. He was shot in the back and in the back of the head.
When police ask for a description of the shooter, the witnesses become reluctant to talk.
Neither of these individuals had like a lengthy history with Saquon or deep connections to him. I kind of think they were just girls he was hanging out with. They'd all been out at the club that night.
All of these young people had this snitches, bring stitches, we don't rat on anyone, that type thing.
Investigators will need to find another way to identify a suspect. Luckily, the weapons found near the scene provide a potential lead.
The guns that were recovered had serial numbers, and they were researched to find out that a Edna Conte had purchased these guns.
Edna Conte is a 22-year-old resident of the Northern Virginia area. And as police quickly discover, she has bought a total of 8 guns in the past 2 months.
A 22-year-old needing 8 guns? Who is this?
Investigators immediately contact Edna, who claims there's a perfectly innocent explanation.
Edna Conte said that she had purchased these 8 guns because she was getting death threats from her boyfriend. And she relayed that she was starting to have suicidal thoughts, so she was going to get rid of the guns. And on the way to get rid of the guns, the car broke down, was towed to the shop, and the guns were subsequently stolen.
But detectives aren't buying it.
There are many lies in homicide investigations, and this was one of them. It appeared that Edna Conte was buying these guns for other people to be put out on the street, making what they call a straw purchase of firearms.
The question is, who wound up with the guns? As police search for answers, Saquon's loved ones gather at the hospital for news of his condition.
I wanted more than anything for my baby to live. I didn't want it to be serious, but it was. The doctors were working on him. They wouldn't let me see him.
Unfortunately, his wounds proved to be too severe.
I don't know if he was bleeding out. Like, they really never gave us too much information on that, but all I know is when they came to us and told him that his time had expired, my mom just like fell out, like in the middle of the floor, body collapsed.
My thoughts and emotions were all over the place. I was devastated. I was in shock.
I couldn't believe it. We all just standing there like he was just here. Like we was just talking to him. We were in the club having a good time.
For police, it means the case has now become a murder investigation.
Edna Conte was arrested on federal gun charges. When it came to the homicide, we discuss tactics and how to move forward and what the next step is.
Detectives investigating the murder of 23-year-old Saquon Hall have little to go on. So far, their best leads are the two guns found near the scene. Since the weapons weren't used in the shooting, police theorize Saquon was the one carrying them. He just didn't get a chance to shoot back.
In any homicide case, the question of motive is something that we think about. There was some indication that they could have been an ambush.
A background check reveals Saquon has a history of getting into trouble. He's been in jail on several different charges, and his name pops up in connection with another homicide.
Pierre Clark was killed about a month before Saquon was killed.
Pierre was very well liked in the community. He had a lot of friends. You know, he was a fixture there.
A lot of people that knew Pierre Clark said that he was a snappy dresser. He always was paying attention to how he looked. And the people in his family said that beyond this big showboat, beyond this big showy personality, Pierre Clark was somebody that really cared for his family.
Like Saquon, 28-year-old Pierre Clark was also trying to overcome a checkered past.
He had had some substance abuse issues, and he was just one of those folks that he was known to the police because of this, but he would kind of float in and out of the legal system.
He'd been going to treatment and recovering from that and had a lot of hopes and dreams to kind of turn his life around and make things better, not just for him, but for his family.
But on the morning of June 8, 2016, Pierre was gunned down outside a public housing complex.
A lot of shootings tend to happen, in the mornings or in the evenings. This one was unusual because it happened in broad daylight.
I was already assigned to Pierre's homicide, but at that point, nobody had been arrested or charged.
Within a few days, however, a familiar name emerged.
It's on the police, the detectives, to do the investigation and to get the evidence necessary. But Saquon was the primary suspect in Pierre's murder.
There was video of Saquon leaving the area. I had informants telling me that he was responsible for it, informants that would testify, informants that would not testify.
Yet his loved ones insisted he was innocent of the shooting of Pierre.
I called him, I'm like, Saquon, where are you? What's going on? I'm at work, I'm here, hearing things that you might have did something. He's like, oh, I'm with Takia and the kids, we're at Funland. And I'm like, okay. There's no way Saquon could have did it. Funland's an hour and a half away from here.
Investigators still needed to talk to him, however, not just to question him about Pierre Clark's murder, but to protect him, too.
I remember telling Patrice, look, they are saying Saquon did this homicide. They're saying Saquon killed Pierre Clark. We need to find Saquon before somebody else does. Even with the people that would talk, there were a lot of people that wouldn't. They want to handle it themselves. They wanted street justice.
Saquon's mother ultimately convinced him to participate in the investigation. But his answers to detectives' questions only increased their suspicions.
He was showing me his cell phone saying I wasn't there, and I grabbed his cell phone and did search warrant. He had said that he was going to see his mom, who worked at a community center in the area, and that didn't match up with the story.
Saquon had told his mother he was at an amusement park at the time of the shooting, not at the community center. The inconsistencies make police even more suspicious.
So I was building the case against Saquon. He was the only suspect.
But before charges could be brought against Saquon, he was murdered. To detectives investigating Saquon's death, the shooting looks like payback for the shooting of Pierre Clark. But Saquon's family still believes he is innocent.
Another mother that I'm close with, she calls me and she said, Miss Patrice, she said, I need to tell you something. And I said, what is it, sweetie? This friend tells me that she witnessed the murder of Pierre. She said, Miss Patrice, it was not your son. She said, because the guy that I saw shoot him was tall. And she also said that he had, there was another guy with him.
In the wake of her son Saquon's death, Patrice Hall turns her outrage into activism.
The murder of Pierre Clark was the third murder that year in that same area. There were a few community meetings that the police hosted in the nearby community center where she and several other mothers in the community were very much involved in trying to get this to stop. At some of those meetings, you had neighbors who were shouting, why can't you fix this? Why is this continuing to happen?
Saquon's loved ones might believe he wasn't involved, but investigators think he may have made some dangerous enemies. Rumor has it that two of these enemies were brothers, Pierre and DeJuan Clark.
Apparently, Saquon's friend had beef with the Clarks. Well, both of them, actually.
Saquon, who was always known to have his friends back, might have joined his friend's ongoing feud with the Clark brothers.
Saquon was somebody who took things very personally. He had a sense of honor about him. If something bad was happening to people around him, Saquon was always the first one to step up and take responsibility for that, to try to fix it.
Saquon's family say his idea of payback wasn't violent like shooting, but it could still have been hurtful to DeJuan.
Saquon decided to, start dating or messing with his child's mom. It made it a little awkward, and it made it more so up on a personal level.
My grandmother used to always say, you try to dig a ditch for someone else that you're going to fall in.
Many believe this personal slight, dating DeJuan's ex, is what led to Saquon's first shooting in June 2015, though Saquon seemed to try to cover for whoever shot him that time.
Saquon was saying, it's self-wound. I did it myself. I had a gun on me, and I put it in my pocket, and I shot myself in the thigh. Although the police can definitely tell that wasn't like a self-inflicted wound.
Everybody knew that there was something going on between Pierre and Saquon.
Many suspected Pierre shot Saquon, though he was never charged in that shooting. But a short time later, both men crossed paths again while in jail for other crimes.
Out of nowhere, Saquon's in the detention center with Pierre. I really don't understand why they would put them on the same unit in the same jail where they could see each other on a daily basis and talk to one another. I heard Pierre told Saquon he wanted to kill him and that whenever they get out, it's basically, whenever I see you, I'm just gonna handle the situation.
Instead, after the two were released, Pierre was the one who was gunned down. At first, it seemed Pierre's brother DeJuan decided to let the feud die with him.
DeJuan very much called for peace in the aftermath of Pierre's murder. And you very much got this sense that DeJuan Clark was very publicly trying to help the family and trying to steer them through this, trying to keep them from retaliating, to hold the family together in the wake of an unimaginable tragedy. But at the same time, I think DeJuan Clark was also really struggling with issues of rage. How do you walk down the street? How do you walk past the site where your brother was murdered and not let that affect you? How do you move on from something that is in your face every single day, especially for something that was at the time an unsolved murder?
Did DeJuan's anger finally get the better of him?
This really reeked of revenge, and you can just see things fall into place. And you better believe people are talking.
Days after the murder of Saquon Hall, detectives have zeroed in on a suspect, 30-year-old DeJuan Clark.
DeJuan Clark's brother, Pierre Clark, had been murdered less than a month prior to Saquon's death. The primary suspect in that case was Saquon Hall. So our belief was that DeJuan Clark murdered Saquon Hall as an act of revenge for Saquon murdering his brother.
So far, none of the eyewitnesses have been willing to identify DeJuan as the shooter. But the many stories about the bad blood between the two men make it hard for investigators to believe no one recognized DeJuan.
When you start hearing a running gun battle, you were going to get people looking out their window, see what's going on. And they had just come back from the club, so there were other people milling around. It was not just Saquon and DeJuan out there. There were other people out there.
There was a significant amount of witness intimidation that was aimed at them, and they were very scared to come to court. So a big part of our job was to try to counteract that, to put them at ease.
Within a week, detectives convinced one of the people involved to come forward.
The individual who drove DeJuan from the scene was ultimately located by law enforcement and provided that information to law enforcement.
According to the eyewitnesses, it started with DeJuan finding out Saquon was in the neighborhood.
The early morning hours of July 2nd, everybody was kind of coming back from the club. Saquon found himself around the area of First Street. Problem is, DeJuan also found him there.
To draw Saquon out, DeJuan apparently issued a challenge.
My brother got a phone call saying like, oh, Wani's over here and he's faking, or faking meaning like telling him to come out, like, you know, basically looking for my brother or whatever. And my brother, although he was little and very skinny, he had like no fear in his heart. Like he was try to fight the biggest sumo wrestler he could find. He would step out there.
Saquon left the party at his friend's house looking for DeJuan. But DeJuan was already lying in wait.
They went around the corner, and then Wani just started shooting at him. But he started to run, and once he got shot in the back and he, you know, hit the ground at the end of the sign, you know, DeJuan came up and finished him, shot him in the head, and walked down the sidewalk, right past the car that the young ladies were sitting in.
And he did this motion to them as he walked past, as if to suggest, shh, right?
When investigators questioned the two young women who were with Saquon again, they confirmed the story.
They did not know him. He wasn't known to them. They did identify him in photo lineups to the police later. And it was through that we were able to identify DeJuan Clark as the shooter. After a warrant was issued for DeJuan Clark's arrest, the next step, of course, is that law enforcement had to find him and arrest him.
But Dewan has already left the state.
We interviewed as many people as we could find that had contact with Dewan.
They couldn't find him. It was like, y'all taking a long time to find somebody that really doesn't have too many resources. I didn't want it to be like my brother ever died for no reason. I did hear that he had probably went to North Carolina.
Kentrice shares this lead with investigators who immediately act on it.
We utilized the U.S. Marshals Task Force to track him down and find him. The Marshals Task Force is comprised of local jurisdictions that come together and they look for people. That's what they do. They're very good at it.
On July 21st, 2016, U.S. Marshals finally get a tip on Dewan's whereabouts.
He was found in North Carolina. He went down there, I want to say, with a cousin. He showed up unannounced at a family member's home with a black trash bag full of his stuff, wanting to stay there.
So the detectives, Detective Gill and Detective Oakley, went to North Carolina to get Dewan.
Nearly 3 weeks after the murder of Saquon Hall, investigators travel to North Carolina to arrest his suspected killer, Dewan Clark. They also want to talk to the family members Dewan had contacted there.
Part of it is you want to retrace somebody's steps. Somebody shows up at your house with a black trash bag full of their stuff saying, I want to stay. What's the first thing you're going to say? What happened? Why are you here? And so as detectives, we want to put all that together. You could find somebody that he confessed to. You could find somebody who has a little more information.
To their surprise, detectives find Dewan lounging by the pool.
He's living his best life. He was trying to figure out who said that he was there, if anybody. So in his head, he's trying to put things together.
While Dewan is taken to jail to await extradition back to Virginia, detectives search the house.
Now, bear in mind, Dewan was arrested in the swimming pool. He didn't have any of his personal items. They were all still in that house, in the bag, and in the room where he was staying. So there are pieces of this that come together with the contents of the bag.
One of the key pieces of evidence is Dewan's phone.
Cell site location data put Dewan Clark in that area at the date and time of the homicide. In addition, further cell phone evidence showed that Dewan had received a text message within minutes of the homicide, which said, "Got him." That was from a known associate of Dewan's, who may also have been in the area that night.
It was sent right after the murder, which leads to more witnesses and more information in this investigation.
Dewan denies any involvement in Saquon's shooting. But by the time police get him back to Virginia, he changed his tune.
I remember at the jail pulling him out of a cruiser. He wanted cigarettes. He wanted to smoke. And Dewan, as he smoked, would talk. And I remember sitting outside of the jail having about a 30-minute conversation with him.
He expressed some sorrow, some regret. This was very much a heat of the moment. This was an anger that had sat in him, and I don't think it brought him any relief.
Dewan stops short of confessing to the murder of Saquon Hall. But he does admit to blaming Saquon for his brother's death.
After the murder of Pierre Clark, Dewan would go down to the location where Pierre was killed. And there was a memorial set up at a tree right there. and he didn't go to work and was spiraling, and the murder of his brother was weighing heavy on him. Saquon Hall was allegedly talking about having killed Pierre Clark. It just got too much for DeJuan to handle. He wanted to make a deal, but as detectives, we're not in a position to make a deal. That's something that only the Commonwealth's attorney can do, state's attorneys in some jurisdictions. In Virginia, it's a Commonwealth's attorney. That is our guy, Sean Sherlock.
DeJuan expressed some remorse about the situation, but he never admitted that he's the one that killed Saquon. So, in considering then, as a prosecutor, how we were going to present the case in court, the question was, all right, what's the evidence here?
Prosecutors feel confident they have a strong enough case against DeJuan to avoid making a deal. On September 26, 2016, they present their evidence in a preliminary hearing.
That's the first court date where DeJuan's in court, we're in court, and we have to present evidence to a judge. And these witnesses, the two eyewitnesses in that car, were subpoenaed for court that day, and they were going to have to testify. Because of the witness intimidation that had been going on and their fear of reprisals here for cooperating with the investigation, they were very scared about being in that place. We ultimately brought them into the court through a side door.
Despite their fear, the two women provide a detailed account of the shooting.
When one of the eyewitnesses testified, I got to that point in her testimony where she was required to identify the person whom she was talking about having seen shoot Saquon in open court. And initially, she couldn't even make eye contact. She couldn't even look at him. She was too scared. And I remember I had to walk a little closer to her and ask her to look around that room and tell the judge if she saw that person here today. And she very bravely at that point did, and then unequivocally identified DeJuan Clark as the shooter.
After the hearing, instead of taking his chances with a jury, DeJuan Clark pleads guilty to second-degree murder.
On July 27th of 2017, DeJuan Clark was sentenced to 43 years. 12 of those 43 years were suspended to do a 31-year stint in prison, and he was also ordered to pay $5,000 towards the funeral costs for Saquon Hall. The Commonwealth of Virginia, there is no early parole in Virginia, and so DeJuan Clark will be in prison for the entirety of those 31 years.
31 years that is a large chunk of somebody's life, and that is 31 years for a rash, heat of the moment decision that will haunt him even after those 31 years are over.
As a detective, you know these people and you see the struggles and you see the successes. And you, as a detective, you want to celebrate the successes and help with the struggle. And when you see a young life like Pierre Clark or Saquon Hall taken for senseless reasons, this street justice and thug life and all this stuff just ends up in people dead.
I feel like second degree wasn't enough. I just feel like my brother's gone. A life is gone. He's never coming back. So in a sense, I feel life for life. So if you took his life, I feel like you should spend the rest of yours behind bars. But I mean, I know eventually one day when I'm about 50 or so, he'll be home. And then I just will have to prepare myself for that.
I can't say that I wanted more time.
There are places that carry memories long after the people have gone. A quiet village. A row of brick houses darkened by the damp English winter. A hospital standing at the edge of town, its windows glowing softly before sunrise while the rest of the streets remain asleep. For generations, hospitals like these represented certainty. Parents walked through their doors believing that no matter how frightening a diagnosis sounded, the people waiting inside would fight for every heartbeat, every breath, every fragile chance at life. In the early months of 1991, families across Lincolnshire believed exactly that. When a child developed a fever that refused to break or struggled to breathe through the night, there was only one destination. Grantham and Kesteven Hospital was not famous. It was not one of Britain's largest medical centres. It was simply the local hospital, familiar to thousands of families who trusted the doctors, the nurses, and the quiet routines that unfolded behind its walls every single day. Mothers carried sleepy toddlers through automatic doors before dawn. Fathers filled out admission forms with trembling hands while pretending not to be afraid. Grandparents waited patiently beside vending machines, convincing themselves that children were resilient and that everything would soon be all right. Hospitals are strange places because they exist somewhere between hope and fear. The corridors are filled with ordinary sounds that become extraordinary when someone you love is lying in a bed nearby. The squeak of rubber shoes against polished floors. The steady rhythm of heart monitors. Curtains sliding shut. A nurse smiling reassuringly before disappearing into another room. Every sound carries meaning. Every silence carries possibility. People rarely remember the names of every doctor they meet. They remember the nurse who held their child's hand. They remember the face that appeared in the doorway when panic began to take over. They remember kindness. Trust is built from moments so small they almost disappear. A blanket tucked around tiny shoulders. A gentle voice explaining that everything will be okay. A warm smile offered during the longest night of a parent's life. Those moments become the foundation upon which entire healthcare systems stand. Without trust, hospitals cannot function. Without trust, every treatment becomes another question waiting for an answer. That is what made what happened in Grantham so difficult to understand. Nothing announced itself at first. There was no dramatic beginning. No obvious warning. No single event that forced everyone to stop and ask impossible questions. Instead, it started the way many tragedies do, with isolated moments that seemed unrelated. A child became unexpectedly ill. Doctors worked frantically. Families prayed. Sometimes the child recovered. Sometimes the outcome was devastating. Medicine is filled with uncertainty, and every experienced clinician knows that even routine illnesses can take sudden, heartbreaking turns. No one expects coincidence to become a pattern. No one imagines that ordinary hospital records, filed neatly inside cabinets, might one day become evidence in one of Britain's most disturbing criminal investigations. In those first weeks, every explanation appeared more reasonable than the truth. Perhaps the patients were simply more vulnerable than expected. Perhaps rare complications were occurring. Perhaps fate had been unusually cruel. The human mind prefers ordinary answers because ordinary answers allow life to continue. If every unexpected event demanded suspicion, trust would collapse under its own weight. Doctors continued treating patients. Nurses continued working their shifts. Parents continued thanking the staff caring for their children. Life inside the pediatric ward moved forward. Morning became afternoon. Afternoon faded into evening. Night staff replaced day staff. New admissions arrived while discharged patients finally returned home. Birthdays were quietly celebrated beside hospital beds. Children's drawings decorated pale walls. Small plastic toys sat forgotten on bedside tables. Television cartoons played softly while exhausted parents tried to stay awake in uncomfortable chairs. Everything looked exactly as it should. That was the most unsettling part. Evil rarely announces itself with dramatic entrances. More often, it hides within ordinary routines, wearing familiar faces, speaking in calm voices, blending into environments built on compassion. It borrows the appearance of normality until people stop noticing it altogether. Looking back, investigators would later reconstruct those weeks with remarkable precision. Times, dates, staff schedules, medical charts, laboratory reports. Every detail that once appeared insignificant slowly acquired new meaning. A sequence that had seemed random began forming a pattern. Individual incidents connected like pieces of a puzzle no one realized they were assembling. But in February 1991, none of those connections yet existed. There were only frightened parents and dedicated medical teams trying to save children whose conditions changed with alarming speed. Some children improved after intensive treatment. Others experienced sudden medical crises that left experienced clinicians searching for explanations. The questions were difficult, but they still belonged within the world of medicine. Nobody had crossed into the world of criminal investigation. Not yet. The families who entered the hospital carried ordinary hopes. They imagined birthday parties postponed for a few days, school lessons waiting after recovery, favorite toys left behind at home until discharge. They expected antibiotics, careful monitoring, reassuring conversations with doctors. They expected uncertainty because illness always brings uncertainty. They did not expect betrayal. The word itself feels almost too small. Betrayal is not simply the breaking of trust. It is the destruction of something people believed could never be broken. Society grants extraordinary responsibility to healthcare professionals because patients often cannot protect themselves. Adults surrender consciousness during surgery. Elderly patients rely upon strangers for daily care. Children, too young to understand what is happening around them, depend entirely upon the adults standing beside their beds. That dependence is sacred. When it is violated, the consequences extend far beyond individual victims. Communities begin questioning institutions they once accepted without hesitation. Parents hesitate before leaving hospital rooms. Healthcare workers find themselves viewed through new eyes despite years of honest service. The damage spreads silently, touching people who had nothing to do with the crime itself. Years later, legal proceedings, expert testimony, and extensive investigations would provide answers to many of the questions that haunted those hospital corridors. Courtrooms would examine medical evidence with extraordinary care. Specialists would revisit laboratory results. Detectives would reconstruct events hour by hour. The justice system would eventually determine criminal responsibility based upon evidence presented before the court. But none of those answers existed at the beginning. Only uncertainty. Only grief. Only a growing feeling among a handful of people that something was deeply, profoundly wrong. There is a moment in many investigations when ordinary life divides into two separate histories. One history belongs to the people who lived through events without understanding them. The other belongs to those who look backward after the truth emerges, seeing warning signs that had once appeared invisible. The line between those histories is often impossibly thin. The story of Beverly Alit exists on that line. It is remembered not simply because crimes occurred within a hospital, but because the setting challenged one of society's oldest assumptions, that the place built to protect the most vulnerable would always remain a refuge from deliberate harm. The crimes for which Alit was later convicted forced Britain to confront painful questions about oversight, accountability, and the limits of institutional trust. Those questions would reshape policies, influence medical practice, and leave lasting scars on families, healthcare workers, and an entire community. This is not merely the story of a criminal case. It is the story of parents who believed they had brought their children to the safest place they could find. It is the story of professionals who struggled to understand events that seemed medically impossible. It is the story of investigators who refused to dismiss a series of unexplained tragedies as coincidence. And above all, it is the story of children whose lives forever changed the way a nation thinks about trust inside hospital walls. Before the headlines. Before the courtroom. Before the verdicts and the public shock, there was only a quiet pediatric ward in rural England, where ordinary days unfolded beneath fluorescent lights, and where no one yet realized that history was already beginning to write one of the darkest chapters in modern British healthcare. Morning arrived the way it always had. The first light crept across the rooftops of Grantham, washing the red brick buildings in pale grey before the sun had gathered enough strength to break through the winter clouds. Delivery vans rolled through nearly empty streets. Shopkeepers unlocked their doors. School children hurried past in oversized coats, their breath visible in the cold air. From the outside, Nothing suggested that this quiet market town in Lincolnshire was about to become known around the world for reasons no community would ever choose. Life continued because life always does. Inside the pediatric ward, routines unfolded with practiced precision. Charts were updated. Temperatures were recorded. Medications were checked and double-checked. Tiny patients drifted between sleep and wakefulness while parents measured time in cups of tea gone cold and the reassuring footsteps of staff moving through the corridor. For families, the hospital represented an interruption, not a destination. They expected to leave. Some imagined returning home within days, carrying children wrapped in blankets and relieved that a frightening episode had become nothing more than a memory. Others knew recovery might take longer, but even then, hope remained the constant companion of every conversation. Hope has a remarkable ability to survive uncertainty. It survives long nights beside hospital beds. It survives difficult conversations with doctors. It survives the sound of machines that parents never expected to learn by heart. That hope is sustained by trust. Every reassuring glance from a nurse, every carefully explained treatment plan, every routine examination reinforces the belief that those caring for vulnerable patients share a single purpose: to help them recover. That belief would later become one of the central themes of this story. Because when investigators eventually pieced together the evidence, they were not simply examining medical records. They were examining the collapse of a relationship built on confidence, a confidence that had taken decades to establish and only weeks to shatter. The events that unfolded during the spring of 1991 would leave questions extending far beyond one hospital or one individual. They would challenge assumptions about how unusual medical events should be recognized, how concerns should be reported, and how institutions respond when the unthinkable appears to be hiding behind ordinary explanations. Those questions did not emerge overnight. They surfaced gradually, almost reluctantly. At first, unusual events were viewed through the lens of medicine. Unexpected complications occur even in experienced hospitals. Children can deteriorate with alarming speed. Rare conditions do exist. Doctors are trained to consider countless medical possibilities before entertaining extraordinary conclusions. That cautious approach saves lives every day. It also explains why recognizing an intentional pattern can be extraordinarily difficult. When something falls outside ordinary experience, people naturally search for ordinary explanations. A laboratory result may be questioned. A diagnosis reconsidered. Equipment inspected. Procedures reviewed. The assumption is not that someone has acted with criminal intent, the assumption is that another medical answer remains undiscovered. This instinct is deeply human. It is also one reason why certain crimes committed within trusted institutions can remain hidden longer than anyone believes possible. Looking back with the benefit of court findings and extensive investigations, it can seem as though the warning signs should have been obvious. But hindsight is deceptive. Information that later forms a clear pattern originally existed as isolated moments experienced by different people at different times. No single doctor, nurse, or family possessed the complete picture from the beginning. Each person saw only one piece. One difficult shift. One unexpected emergency. One heartbreaking outcome. Only much later would those fragments begin to fit together. For the families, however, none of that mattered in the immediate moment. Their worlds had narrowed to the space surrounding a hospital bed. They watched monitors instead of clocks. They celebrated small improvements that outsiders might never notice: a stronger grip, a steadier breath, a few extra bites of food. Their concerns were immediate, deeply personal, and profoundly ordinary. They were not thinking about criminal investigations. They were thinking about getting their children home. It is important to remember that reality whenever this case is discussed. Public attention often focuses on the person later convicted, on courtroom testimony, or on the shocking nature of the crimes. Yet the center of the story belongs elsewhere. It belongs to the children whose futures were interrupted and to the families whose memories of what should have been a place of healing became inseparable from grief and unanswered questions. Every medical chart represented a child with a favorite toy, a bedtime routine, a family waiting anxiously at home. Every hospital bracelet belonged to someone known not by a case number but by a name. That perspective matters because true crime, at its best, is not about transforming suffering into spectacle. It is about understanding how events unfolded, how institutions responded, and what lessons were learned to reduce the risk of similar tragedies in the future. The investigation that followed would eventually involve detectives, medical experts, forensic specialists, and legal professionals working through thousands of pages of records. Their task was painstaking. They were required to separate coincidence from evidence, suspicion from proof, and emotion from fact. The conclusions ultimately presented in court rested not on a single dramatic discovery but on the accumulation of evidence examined over time. That distinction is essential. The justice system demands proof precisely because extraordinary allegations require extraordinary care. As this story unfolds, there will be moments when events appear confusing, when early assumptions prove incorrect, and when investigators themselves struggle to reconcile medical uncertainty with emerging evidence. Those complexities are part of the historical record. They remind us that real investigations rarely resemble fiction. Progress is uneven. Answers arrive slowly. Certainty is earned rather than assumed. And so, before we examine the people, the timeline, and the investigation itself, it is worth pausing on one final image. Imagine a parent quietly pulling a blanket over a sleeping child in a hospital room late at night. Outside, rain taps gently against the windows. Down the corridor, staff continue their work beneath bright fluorescent lights. Everything appears calm. Everything appears routine. In moments like these, trust is almost invisible because it feels so natural that no one thinks to question it. The story of Beverly Alit would forever change that feeling for many families in Britain. Not because it erased the dedication of countless honest healthcare professionals, but because it demonstrated how profoundly damaging it can be when that trust is abused. It prompted reforms, strengthened oversight, and encouraged greater vigilance within healthcare settings. Those changes became part of the case's lasting legacy, shaped not by fear alone but by a determination to learn from a tragedy that should never have happened. And before the names filled newspaper headlines, before the courtroom proceedings began, before the country struggled to understand how such events could occur, there was only a small hospital caring for children. Unaware that it stood at the beginning of one of the most consequential criminal investigations in modern British medical history. The search for answers had not yet begun, but the questions were already waiting. OK. There is another reason this case continues to be studied more than 3 decades later. It is not simply because of the convictions that followed, or because the crimes occurred inside a hospital. It is because the events exposed how difficult it can be to recognize an extraordinary problem when every individual event appears, at first, to have an ordinary explanation. That challenge has influenced discussions in medicine, law, and patient safety ever since. In 1991, communication within hospitals looked very different from today. Medical records were largely paper-based, information traveled more slowly, and identifying subtle patterns often depended on experienced clinicians noticing similarities across separate cases. Most days, that system worked well because serious criminal acts within healthcare settings were exceptionally rare. The expectation was that unusual medical events would eventually reveal a clinical explanation rather than evidence of deliberate wrongdoing. Against that backdrop, the pediatric ward in Grantham functioned much like countless others across Britain. It was a place where children arrived with a wide range of illnesses, from common infections to more complicated conditions requiring close observation. Doctors, nurses, laboratory staff, and support workers all shared responsibility for caring for patients whose needs could change rapidly. Decisions had to be made quickly, often with incomplete information, and every member of the team depended on the professionalism of everyone else. That interdependence is one of healthcare's greatest strengths. It is also one of its greatest vulnerabilities when trust is broken. The story that follows is therefore not about questioning an entire profession. On the contrary, it highlights the extraordinary efforts of investigators, clinicians, forensic experts, and hospital staff who, once concerns emerged, worked painstakingly to understand what had happened. Their work would ultimately contribute not only to a criminal prosecution but also to important discussions about safeguarding patients, improving oversight, and recognizing unusual patterns of harm. Those lessons came at an immeasurable human cost. For the families at the center of this case, the passage of time has never erased the emotional weight of those weeks in 1991. Public attention often focuses on dates, verdicts, and headlines, but behind every page of evidence was a family whose memories of childhood became permanently divided into two chapters: life before the hospital admission and life afterward. That human reality deserves to remain at the center of any discussion of the case. As we move deeper into this story, we will separate verified facts from speculation, distinguish courtroom evidence from later commentary, and follow the investigation as it unfolded rather than through the clarity of hindsight. Understanding how investigators reached their conclusions is just as important as understanding the conclusions themselves. Because history is rarely defined by a single moment. It is shaped by hundreds of small decisions, observations, and questions that gradually reveal a larger truth. The story of Beverly Alit is one of those histories. It is a story about trust, accountability, and the determination to seek answers when events refuse to fit the explanations that once seemed sufficient. It begins in an ordinary English town, inside an ordinary hospital, where ordinary people believed they were living through ordinary days until the evidence began to suggest otherwise. And that is where our story truly begins. In the heart of Lincolnshire, surrounded by gently rolling farmland and quiet country roads, sits the market town of Grantham. To many people outside the East Midlands, it was simply another English town, modest, familiar, and largely untouched by the pace of Britain's larger cities. Life moved according to routines that had remained remarkably consistent for generations. Shops opened early along the high street. Church bells marked the passing hours. Neighbors greeted one another by name. Children walked to school beneath rows of brick buildings that had witnessed decades of ordinary lives unfolding one season after another. It was the kind of community where people expected familiarity. Doctors often treated multiple generations of the same family. Local shop owners remembered regular customers without needing to ask their names. News traveled quickly, not through headlines, but through conversations exchanged at cafes, church gatherings, and weekend football matches. In places like Grantham, trust was not simply an abstract idea. It formed part of everyday life, built slowly through years of shared experience. Healthcare reflected that same sense of familiarity. For many families living in and around Grantham, the local hospital was more than a medical institution. It represented reassurance. Parents knew where to drive in the middle of the night if a child developed a high fever. Elderly residents recognized members of staff from previous visits. Nurses and doctors were not anonymous professionals working in distant cities, they were often members of the same community, sharing the same streets and shops as the people they cared for. This close relationship between hospital and community created a powerful foundation of confidence. Like many National Health Service hospitals of the early 1990s, Grantham and Kesteven Hospital operated within a healthcare system built upon public trust. The NHS had become one of Britain's defining institutions, providing care regardless of income and serving millions of patients every year. Although resources could be limited and staff frequently worked under pressure, the overwhelming majority of healthcare professionals were deeply committed to their patients. Long shifts, overnight emergencies, and emotionally demanding work were accepted as part of the profession. Parents rarely questioned whether their children would receive compassionate care. They assumed they would. That assumption had been earned through decades of dedicated service by countless doctors, nurses, therapists, laboratory technicians, and support staff across the country. Inside the pediatric ward, each day followed a rhythm that appeared almost timeless. Morning rounds began early. Medical teams reviewed overnight observations before discussing treatment plans for every child. Nurses checked temperatures, monitored breathing, administered prescribed medications, and comforted anxious parents who often struggled to understand unfamiliar medical terminology. Meals arrived according to schedule. Specialists visited when necessary. Throughout the day, telephones rang, monitors sounded brief alarms, and conversations drifted quietly between patient rooms. To an outsider, the ward might have appeared surprisingly calm. Bright drawings made by former patients decorated portions of the walls. Small toys waited inside play areas for children well enough to leave their beds. Volunteers occasionally stopped by with books or games designed to distract young patients from uncomfortable procedures or long afternoons indoors. The atmosphere reflected an important principle of pediatric medicine: children should never feel that illness defines them completely. Yet beneath that reassuring environment existed the realities familiar to every children's hospital. Illness does not follow schedules. A child who appears stable during breakfast may require emergency treatment before lunch. Another who arrives with what seems to be a routine infection may unexpectedly develop serious complications. Pediatric medicine demands constant vigilance because young patients often deteriorate more rapidly than adults. Healthcare professionals understand this uncertainty better than anyone else. For that reason, sudden changes in a child's condition are not automatically viewed as suspicious. They are first approached as medical emergencies. This distinction would later become one of the most significant aspects of the Grantham investigation. At the beginning of 1991, nobody arrived at work expecting to uncover criminal behavior. Physicians focused on diagnosis. Nurses concentrated on patient care. Laboratory staff analyzed blood samples. Administrators ensured that wards remained staffed despite the constant pressures facing the healthcare system. Every individual understood their responsibilities within a complex network designed to protect vulnerable patients. The system relied upon cooperation. It also relied upon professional integrity. Every medication administered required confidence that established procedures would be followed. Every clinical observation depended upon accurate documentation. Every emergency response assumed that information passed between colleagues was complete and reliable. Modern healthcare cannot function without those assumptions because no single individual witnesses every aspect of every patient's care. Instead, professionals rely upon one another. That reliance is essential. Looking back today, it is tempting to imagine warning signs standing out clearly against the background of ordinary hospital life. Historical documentaries, books, and courtroom summaries naturally organize events into coherent timelines. Patterns become visible because investigators eventually assembled every available piece of information into one comprehensive picture. Real life rarely unfolds that way. In reality, information exists in fragments. One nurse notices an unusual laboratory result. A doctor recalls an unexpected deterioration. Another member of staff remembers a difficult shift from several weeks earlier. Each observation remains incomplete until someone recognizes that they may be connected. That process often requires time. Time, however, is a luxury rarely available in busy hospitals. Every new admission demands immediate attention. Every emergency interrupts planned routines. Staff members finish demanding shifts only to return the following morning ready to care for an entirely different group of patients. Their focus naturally remains on the next child requiring treatment rather than searching for hidden relationships between events that, at first glance, appear unrelated. Understanding that environment is essential to understanding everything that followed. The investigation that would later emerge did not begin because one dramatic discovery suddenly exposed the truth. It developed gradually as experienced professionals became increasingly concerned that a series of unusual medical events could no longer be explained solely through ordinary clinical reasoning. That realization came only after careful observation, discussion, and the accumulation of evidence over time. The hospital itself became an unexpected setting for questions few people had ever imagined asking. Not because hospitals are dangerous places. Statistically, they remain among the safest environments for receiving medical treatment, supported by dedicated professionals who save lives every day. Rather, this case demonstrated that even trusted institutions require systems capable of identifying exceptionally rare events without undermining the confidence upon which effective healthcare depends. That balance remains one of the enduring lessons of the Grantham case. Too little oversight can allow important warning signs to go unnoticed. Too much suspicion can damage the trust necessary for compassionate patient care. Finding the right balance continues to shape patient safety policies decades after these events occurred. For the families who walked through the hospital's entrance in early 1991, none of these broader questions were visible. Their concerns were immediate and deeply personal. They wanted reassuring news from doctors. They hoped for improving test results. They counted successful treatments one day at a time. Like parents everywhere, they believed that bringing an ill child to hospital was the most responsible decision they could make. That belief was entirely reasonable. It reflected generations of experience with a healthcare system that had earned public confidence through dedication, expertise, and compassion. It is precisely because that confidence existed so strongly that the events which followed resonated so deeply across Britain. The story was never only about one individual. It became a story about how institutions respond when faced with circumstances almost beyond imagination, how investigators distinguish fact from assumption, and how communities rebuild trust after it has been profoundly shaken. As winter slowly gave way to spring in Lincolnshire, life in Grantham continued much as it always had. Cars filled the hospital parking lot each morning. Staff changed shifts. Parents waited anxiously beside hospital beds. Children laughed when they felt well enough to play and cried when treatments became uncomfortable. From the outside, the hospital remained what it had always appeared to be, a place devoted to healing. No one yet understood that the ordinary routines unfolding within its walls would soon become the focus of one of the most closely examined healthcare investigations in modern British history. The setting was quiet. The community was close-knit. The trust was genuine. And it was within that ordinary world that an extraordinary investigation would begin. By the early months of 1991, Grantham and Kesteven Hospital represented something familiar to communities across Britain, a local institution built on routine, expertise, and public confidence. The hospital was not a place people associated with fear. It was a place people entered when they needed help. A building designed around the simple promise that when a family faced one of the most frightening moments of their lives, trained professionals would be there to provide care. For parents bringing their children to the pediatric ward, the hospital often became a temporary world separate from everyday life. The concerns of school, work, household responsibilities, and ordinary routines faded into the background. Time was measured differently. A few minutes waiting for a doctor's update could feel endless. A small improvement in a child's condition could bring enormous relief. Healthcare environments are built around these emotional realities. Medical staff do not only treat illnesses, they also support families experiencing uncertainty and fear. A nurse's reassurance, a doctor's explanation, or a simple gesture of kindness can become a memory that remains with families for years. This relationship between healthcare workers and patients is based on confidence. Patients trust that procedures will be followed. Families trust that concerns will be listened to. Hospitals trust that staff members will carry out their responsibilities with professionalism and care. That trust is not created by one person or one moment. It is created by thousands of interactions repeated every day across countless hospitals. It depends on training, ethical standards, supervision, and the shared understanding that vulnerable people deserve protection. During the period when the events connected to Beverley Alit occurred, the National Health Service was already facing many of the challenges common to large healthcare systems. Hospitals were managing limited resources, increasing demands, and the constant pressure to provide high-quality care to growing numbers of patients. Technology was also different from what many hospitals use today. Electronic systems that can instantly compare data across departments were not widely available. Patient information was primarily recorded through paper documentation. Identifying patterns often depended on communication between individuals who might each have only seen a small part of a larger situation. In medicine, patterns matter. A single unusual event may have many possible explanations. A series of related events can tell a different story. Recognizing that difference requires careful observation and professional judgment. This is one of the reasons patient safety systems have continued to evolve. Modern healthcare places increasing emphasis on reporting unexpected incidents, reviewing trends, and encouraging staff members to raise concerns when something appears unusual. These practices are not based on assuming wrongdoing. They are based on understanding that complex systems can only improve when problems are examined openly. The Grantham case became an important example of why those safeguards matter. However, before investigators became involved, before evidence was reviewed, and before courts examined the case, there were people simply trying to do their jobs. Doctors were trying to understand medical problems. Nurses were trying to provide comfort and treatment. Parents were trying to make decisions for their children during moments of extreme uncertainty. This human dimension is essential because investigations are not carried out in abstract environments. They happen among real people whose lives continue after the headlines disappear. For healthcare workers, cases involving harm within medical settings can create a unique kind of emotional conflict. Many enter the profession because they want to help others. When trust within that profession is damaged, the impact extends beyond the immediate investigation. Staff members may question procedures, communication, and whether warning signs could have been recognized earlier. Communities often experience a similar process. A hospital that once represented reassurance can become associated with painful memories. Families who previously viewed medical professionals as sources of comfort may struggle with difficult questions about how something unexpected could happen in a place designed for protection. These reactions are understandable because hospitals occupy a special position in society. They are not ordinary workplaces. They are places where people surrender control during moments of vulnerability. A child cannot explain every symptom. A frightened patient cannot always advocate for themselves. A family facing a medical crisis depends on others to act in their best interest. That responsibility is one of the most important foundations of healthcare. The investigation into events at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital would eventually lead to one of the most closely examined criminal cases involving a healthcare worker in modern British history. But before the investigation unfolded, there was a period when people inside the hospital were attempting to make sense of unexplained events through the framework available to them. Medicine begins with questions. What is causing this condition? Why is this patient not responding as expected? What treatment can provide the best outcome? Those questions guide doctors and nurses every day. The challenge arises when the answer may exist outside the usual boundaries of medical explanation. The transition from medical concern to criminal investigation is not simple. It requires evidence. It requires careful analysis. It requires investigators and medical experts to examine facts rather than assumptions. That process would become central to the events that followed. The story of Beverly Alit is often remembered because of the shocking nature of the crimes for which she was convicted. But the wider historical significance lies in the questions the case raised about accountability, oversight, and the protection of vulnerable patients. How should institutions respond when unusual events appear? How can concerns be identified before patterns become tragedies? How can healthcare systems maintain trust while continuously examining their own weaknesses? These questions remain relevant today. Every hospital depends on systems designed to protect patients. Those systems include professional training, supervision, reporting procedures, and a culture where concerns can be raised. They are strengthened not by ignoring difficult situations, but by examining them honestly. The lessons from Grantham were shaped by painful experiences, but they contributed to changes intended to improve patient safety. For the families affected, however, policy changes could never replace what was lost. Statistics, reports, and legal documents can describe events, but they cannot fully represent the personal impact carried by those who lived through them. Behind every investigation file are individual lives. Children remembered by their families. Parents who carried hopes and fears through hospital corridors. Healthcare workers who faced the responsibility of understanding what had happened. As the investigation would later reveal, uncovering the truth required patience, evidence, and a willingness to challenge assumptions. The process did not happen instantly. It developed through careful examination of information that, piece by piece, began to create a clearer picture. The quiet routines of a local hospital had become the foundation of a much larger national conversation. A conversation about trust. A conversation about responsibility. And a conversation about the duty to protect those who are least able to protect themselves. The significance of Grantham and Kesteven Hospital in this story was not because it was an unusual place. In many ways, that was precisely what made the events that unfolded there so difficult for people to comprehend. It was a local hospital serving ordinary families. The patients who entered its doors were not statistics. They were children with parents who knew their favorite foods, their habits, their personalities, and the small details that made them unique. A medical record might contain dates, observations, and treatment notes, but behind every document was a family waiting for a child to return home. This distinction would become increasingly important as the investigation developed. Public discussions about criminal cases often focus on timelines and evidence, but the reality behind those details is much more personal. For families affected by serious harm, the aftermath does not end when an investigation begins or when a court reaches a verdict. The consequences continue through memories, anniversaries, and the absence of futures that had once seemed certain. The events connected to Grantham changed the way many people viewed safety within healthcare environments. Before this case, most members of the public rarely considered the possibility that a healthcare professional could intentionally harm patients. The relationship between patient and caregiver was built on an assumption of shared purpose. One person was vulnerable, and the other was there to help. That assumption is central to medicine. Without trust, healthcare becomes impossible. A patient must be able to accept treatment recommendations. A parent must be able to leave a child in the care of trained professionals. A community must believe that institutions created to protect people are working toward that goal. When trust is damaged, rebuilding it requires more than statements of reassurance. It requires transparency, accountability, and meaningful changes that demonstrate lessons have been learned. In the years following the case, healthcare organizations placed increasing emphasis on systems designed to identify concerns earlier. These included stronger approaches to reporting unusual incidents, reviewing patterns of events, and ensuring that staff members felt able to raise concerns without hesitation. One important lesson from cases such as this is that safety does not depend only on individual actions. It depends on the structure surrounding those individuals. Good systems create multiple layers of protection. They encourage communication between teams. They ensure that unusual information is not ignored simply because it does not immediately fit an expected explanation. They recognize that asking difficult questions is not a sign of failure, it is part of protecting patients. For medical professionals, this balance can be challenging. Healthcare requires confidence and decisiveness, but it also requires humility, the understanding that even experienced teams must continue learning and reviewing their practices. The Grantham investigation became part of a broader discussion about how institutions respond when something appears wrong. It highlighted the importance of listening carefully to concerns, examining evidence objectively, and ensuring that the responsibility for patient safety is shared across an organization. At the same time, it is important not to allow one criminal case to define an entire profession. Across Britain and around the world, millions of healthcare workers continue to provide compassionate care every day. They comfort families during difficult moments, work long hours, and make decisions that can change lives. The actions of one individual do not represent the dedication of an entire profession. However, precisely because healthcare workers hold such important responsibilities, cases involving abuse of that trust require serious examination. The story of Beverly Alit therefore became not only a criminal investigation but also a case study in institutional response. It raised questions about awareness. It raised questions about communication. It raised questions about how organizations recognize risks before they become larger problems. These questions remain relevant decades later because healthcare continues to evolve. Hospitals today are larger, more technologically advanced, and increasingly dependent on complex systems of information sharing. Yet the fundamental principle remains unchanged: Vulnerable people must be protected by both compassionate individuals and reliable structures. The setting of this story, the small town hospital in Lincolnshire, reminds us that major historical events do not always begin in places associated with national attention. Sometimes they begin in ordinary communities, within ordinary institutions, among people who are simply trying to do their jobs and care for those who need them. That is why understanding the background matters. Before there was an investigation, there was a hospital. Before there were court proceedings, there were families seeking answers. Before there were headlines, there were quiet moments of uncertainty that few people outside the hospital knew about. The path from those early concerns to a national criminal case would involve careful examination, difficult decisions, and the work of many people determined to understand what had happened. The next chapter of this story moves from the setting to the people most affected, the children and families at the center of the case. Their experiences provide the most important perspective, not as details within an investigation, but as human lives forever changed by events they never should have experienced. The victim's story begins not with a courtroom, not with an investigation file, and not with the person whose name would later dominate headlines. It begins with children. Children who, like millions of others, were simply trying to grow up. They were not symbols. They were not case numbers. They were sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, grandchildren and friends. They were young lives surrounded by people who knew their personalities, their favorite games, their expressions, and the small habits that made them who they were. For the families connected to the events at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital, the memories of that time were not created by newspaper reports or legal documents. Their memories were built from ordinary moments, preparing for a hospital visit, waiting for medical updates, holding a child's hand, and hoping that the next conversation with doctors would bring reassuring news. A child's illness changes the entire rhythm of a family. The concerns of everyday life suddenly become distant. Work schedules, household tasks, and future plans are replaced by immediate questions. Will my child feel better tomorrow? Will the treatment work? When can we go home? For parents, hospitals are places where fear and hope exist side by side. They arrive because they believe medical professionals can provide something they cannot provide themselves: knowledge, experience, and care. That trust is especially powerful when the patient is a child. Children are among the most vulnerable people in any healthcare setting. They often cannot fully explain what they are feeling. They cannot always understand why procedures are necessary. They rely completely on the adults around them to make decisions on their behalf. Their parents become their voices. Their caregivers become their protectors. That relationship forms the foundation of pediatric medicine. The children involved in this case came to hospital because their families believed they would receive help. Their admissions were not extraordinary events from the perspective of those families. They were moments that thousands of parents experience every year: a child becoming unwell, a decision to seek medical attention, and the hope that professional care will lead to recovery. No family enters a hospital expecting their trust to become part of a criminal investigation. That reality is what makes cases involving harm within healthcare settings so deeply painful. The place associated with healing becomes connected with questions that families never imagined they would have to ask. For the families affected, the passage of time does not erase those questions. They remember the moments before everything changed. They remember conversations with medical staff. They remember waiting. They remember uncertainty. And they remember the children themselves, not as victims in a legal case, but as individuals whose lives mattered beyond the events that brought public attention. One of the challenges in discussing true crime is remembering that every investigation file represents human experiences. Statistics can summarize the scale of an event, but numbers cannot describe the personality of a child, the hopes of a family, or the future that was imagined before tragedy occurred. Behind every medical record was a story. A child who had a place in the world. A family who loved them. A future that was still unfolding. The legal process that followed would eventually examine evidence and determine responsibility according to the standards of the court. But long before legal conclusions were reached, families were already living with the emotional impact of what had happened. Their experiences also shaped the wider conversation about patient safety. When society discusses cases involving failures of trust, there is a tendency to focus on the person responsible and the actions that led to harm. Those questions are important, but another question remains equally significant. How can systems better protect vulnerable people? The answer requires remembering the people those systems exist to serve. Patients are not simply medical cases. Children are not simply names on documents. Families are not simply witnesses in an investigation. They are the reason healthcare exists. The legacy of the Grantham case is therefore connected not only to criminal justice but also to a broader commitment to safeguarding. The changes that followed were intended to strengthen protection for future patients, improve communication, and encourage healthcare organizations to respond carefully when concerns emerge. Those lessons came from a painful chapter in many families' lives. The children at the center of this story should be remembered first and foremost as children. Their identities were shaped by the people who loved them, the moments they shared, and the lives they touched, not only by the circumstances that brought them into public attention. As the investigation moved forward, attention would turn toward evidence, timelines, and unanswered questions. But before examining those developments, it is important to keep in view the human reality behind the case. Every investigation begins with events. Every legal process begins with evidence. But every story begins with people. For the families affected by the events at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital, the hardest part of understanding what happened was not only confronting the past, but accepting that the future they imagined had changed forever. Before the investigation, before the legal proceedings, and before the public knew the name Beverly Alit, these families were living ordinary lives. They were making plans. They were celebrating small milestones. They were watching their children grow, learn, laugh, and discover the world around them. That is often what is lost when a case becomes known only through headlines. A headline reduces a complex human story into a few words. A court document reduces a lifetime into pages of evidence. But families remember something much larger. They remember personalities. They remember expressions. They remember voices. They remember the small details that never appear in official records. A child is never defined by the circumstances surrounding a tragedy. A child is remembered through the life they brought into the world and the people who loved them. For parents, the experience of having a child admitted to hospital is already emotionally overwhelming. Many parents describe those moments as existing outside normal time. Days become measured by medical updates rather than calendars. A short conversation with a doctor can determine the mood of an entire day. A reassuring sign can bring hope. A setback can create fear that feels impossible to explain. In those moments, parents place their confidence in the healthcare system. They trust that every person involved in their child's care shares the same goal, helping that child recover. That trust is one of the most important foundations of medical care. The events that occurred in Grantham therefore affected not only the families directly involved, but also the wider community that had relied on the hospital as a place of safety. Many people struggled to understand how a setting created to protect vulnerable patients could become associated with such a painful chapter. For those who worked in healthcare, the case created its own complicated emotions. Many medical professionals dedicate their lives to helping others, often under difficult circumstances. When a case involving abuse of professional trust emerges, it creates a painful contrast between the purpose of healthcare and the actions of one individual. The overwhelming majority of healthcare workers continue to provide compassionate and ethical care every day. However, cases like this demonstrate why strong safeguards, accountability, and communication systems are essential. Protection cannot depend only on good intentions. It must also depend on reliable structures. For the families affected, though, discussions about systems and policies could never replace personal loss. Institutional changes may help protect future patients, but they cannot undo what happened to those who lived through the events of 1991. That reality is why remembering the victims remains central. Their stories are not only part of a criminal case. They are part of the history of families who experienced fear, uncertainty, and grief. They are also part of a larger conversation about how society cares for its most vulnerable members. Children entering hospitals are among those who rely most completely on adults around them. They depend on parents, doctors, nurses, and institutions to make decisions with their best interests at heart. Protecting that trust requires constant attention. It requires people to speak when something seems unusual. It requires organizations to listen. It requires systems that allow concerns to be examined carefully and fairly. The lessons that emerged from the Grantham case were shaped by painful circumstances, but they contributed to changes intended to improve patient safety. Hospitals and healthcare organizations have continued to develop stronger approaches to monitoring, reporting, and responding to concerns. Those changes are part of the case's broader legacy. Yet the most important legacy remains the children themselves. They should not be remembered only because of what happened to them. They should be remembered because they were loved. Because they mattered to their families. Because their lives had meaning beyond the investigation that followed. True crime stories often focus naturally on the person accused, the evidence collected, and the legal outcome. But a responsible examination of any case must always return to the people most affected. The victims are not simply the beginning of a story. They are the reason the story must be told with care. As investigators later examined medical records, witness accounts, and evidence connected to the case, their work was ultimately an effort to answer questions created by suffering. The pursuit of justice was not only about determining what happened. It was also about acknowledging the experiences of those who had been affected. Behind every investigation are human lives. Behind every legal decision are families waiting for answers. And behind every case involving vulnerable victims is a reminder of the responsibility society carries to protect those who cannot protect themselves. When examining a case like this decades later, one of the greatest challenges is preserving the humanity of those affected. Time has a way of turning personal experiences into historical records. Names become entries in reports. Events become timelines. Court decisions become references in legal discussions. But for the families involved, the events were never simply history. They were moments that changed the direction of their lives. The children connected to this case existed before they became part of an investigation. They had routines, personalities, and relationships that extended far beyond the hospital rooms where they received treatment. They were known within their families in ways no official document could ever fully capture. A parent knows the sound of their child's laughter. They know the expressions that appear when a child is curious, excited, tired, or afraid. They know the small habits that seem insignificant to others but become precious memories over time. Those are the details that remain. In discussions about serious crimes, there is often a natural focus on understanding the person responsible and the process that brought them to justice. Those questions are important. Society needs to understand how such events occurred and how institutions can prevent similar failures in the future. But understanding a case also requires remembering who was affected most deeply. The children and their families were not participants in a public story. They were people experiencing private moments of fear, uncertainty, and loss. For many parents, the decision to bring a child to hospital represents an act of protection. It is a moment when they place their trust in others because they believe trained professionals can provide care beyond what they themselves can offer. That decision reflects one of the most fundamental relationships in healthcare. A patient arrives in a vulnerable position. A healthcare professional accepts responsibility. The institution provides the environment in which that care takes place. Each part of that relationship depends on trust. When that trust is damaged, the consequences reach beyond individual cases. They affect how communities view medical institutions and how families approach healthcare in the future. The Grantham case became a reminder that protecting patients requires more than skilled treatment alone. It requires systems that encourage openness, careful observation, and communication between everyone involved in care. Healthcare environments are complex. Hundreds of decisions may be made every day. Many different professionals contribute to a patient's treatment. Because of that complexity, Safety depends on creating a culture where concerns can be raised and examined. A question asked at the right time can prevent harm. An observation shared with the right person can reveal important information. A concern that is taken seriously can become an opportunity to protect patients. These principles became increasingly important in the years following the case. However, for the families who lived through the events, improvements in policy could never change the personal reality they faced. Reports and recommendations could explain what institutions learned, but they could not remove the emotional impact carried by those who lost moments, memories, and futures they had expected to share with their children. This is why responsible storytelling matters. A victim should never exist only as a detail within another person's story. The children at the center of this case deserve to be remembered as individuals whose lives had value independent of the tragedy surrounding them. Their families carried their memories forward. Their communities remembered them. And the lessons created from their experiences became part of a wider effort to improve protection for future patients. The investigation that followed would involve difficult questions. It would require experts to examine evidence, investigators to reconstruct events, and courts to determine responsibility. But before any of those processes began, there was a much simpler reality. Families had trusted a place of care to protect their children. They had entered the hospital hoping for recovery. They had expected reassurance. The story that unfolded afterward changed their understanding of that trust forever. Looking back, the most important question is not only how the investigation reached its conclusions, but also what society chooses to remember. The answer should not be only the actions of one individual. It should also include the lives of the children affected, the strength of the families who endured unimaginable circumstances, and the continuing responsibility to create healthcare systems where every vulnerable patient receives the protection they deserve. Because behind every case file is a person. Behind every statistic is a family. And behind every lesson learned is a human story that should never be forgotten. The first signs of a crisis rarely arrive with certainty. They arrive as questions. In a hospital environment, questions are part of everyday life. Doctors question symptoms. Nurses question changes in a patient's condition. Families question medical decisions because they want to understand what is happening to someone they love. Most questions have ordinary answers. A medication may need adjusting. A diagnosis may need reconsidering. A patient's condition may simply be more serious than first expected. That is the nature of medicine. Even with experienced professionals and advanced knowledge, uncertainty is always present. At Grantham and Kesteven Hospital in early 1991, the events that would later become the center of a major investigation initially appeared within that familiar world of medical uncertainty. Children receiving care in the pediatric ward experienced unexpected medical emergencies. Staff responded as they were trained to do, assessing conditions, providing treatment, and attempting to understand why these situations had occurred. At the time, there was no immediate explanation that connected these events. Each incident existed on its own. Each child had their own medical history. Each emergency required attention in the moment. This is one of the most difficult aspects of recognizing patterns within healthcare. A single unexpected event may not reveal anything unusual. Medical professionals must consider common explanations first because common explanations are, in fact, the most likely. However, as more incidents occurred within a relatively short period, some members of the medical team began to notice that the number of serious events appeared unusual. The concern was not based on panic. It was based on observation. Healthcare professionals are trained to recognize when something does not fit expected patterns. A sudden change in circumstances, an unusual sequence of events, or repeated situations that are difficult to explain can create a need for closer examination. In the pediatric ward, those concerns developed gradually. There were discussions among staff. There were reviews of medical information. There were attempts to understand whether there might be a clinical explanation connecting the events. At this stage, the focus remained on patient care and medical investigation. The priority was not accusation. The priority was understanding. This distinction is important because serious allegations require careful evidence. Hospitals cannot function if every unexpected outcome immediately becomes a criminal suspicion. At the same time, patient safety depends on the willingness to investigate when circumstances genuinely raise concerns. Finding that balance would become one of the major lessons of the case. As staff reviewed what had happened, attention began turning toward details that previously seemed routine. In healthcare, documentation is essential because patient care depends on accurate records. Notes about treatments, observations, and timelines allow different professionals to work together. Those same records can later become crucial when investigators attempt to reconstruct events. A medical chart created for patient care can eventually become part of a much larger search for answers. The process of looking backward is complex. Investigators must consider information that was not necessarily understood at the time it was recorded. A detail that appeared insignificant during a busy hospital shift may later become important when viewed alongside other evidence. This is how many investigations develop. Not through one dramatic discovery, but through accumulation. One piece of information. One conversation. One observation. Gradually, separate events begin to appear connected. For the families involved, however, there was no awareness of this larger process at the beginning. Their attention remained focused on their own children. They were experiencing events personally, not as part of a developing investigation. Parents do not enter hospitals thinking about patterns. They think about recovery. They think about going home. They think about returning to normal life. The possibility that something beyond ordinary medical complications might be involved was difficult for many people to imagine. That difficulty was understandable. Healthcare institutions are built upon trust, and trust shapes expectations. When someone enters a hospital, they generally assume that everyone inside shares the same responsibility, protecting patients. The idea that this trust could be violated represented a possibility that many people were not prepared to consider. As concerns continued to develop, hospital staff faced an increasingly difficult challenge. They had to respond to immediate medical needs while also examining whether there was a broader issue requiring attention. These two responsibilities existed at the same time. Care for the patients who needed help immediately, and investigation into why these events were occurring. The eventual investigation would involve medical experts, police officers, and legal authorities working together to examine evidence carefully. But before those outside agencies became central to the story, the first questions came from within the hospital itself. They came from people whose responsibility was simple: protect the children in their care. The early stages of the incident were therefore not defined by certainty, but by growing concern. A hospital built around routine suddenly faced a situation where routine explanations appeared increasingly incomplete. The questions became harder. The answers became more important. And slowly, the events at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital moved from being viewed as isolated medical emergencies toward becoming the subject of one of Britain's most significant investigations involving a healthcare worker. As the weeks passed, the atmosphere inside the pediatric ward began to change. Not in a way that was immediately visible to everyone. There were no dramatic announcements. No single moment when the entire hospital stopped and recognized that something extraordinary was happening. Instead, the change appeared quietly, through conversations between professionals who were trying to understand a series of events that did not seem to follow the patterns they were accustomed to seeing. In medicine, uncertainty is normal. Doctors and nurses work every day with conditions that do not always behave exactly as expected. Children, especially, can experience rapid changes in their health. A patient who appears stable can suddenly require urgent attention. A condition that seems minor can sometimes develop into something more serious. Because of this reality, healthcare professionals must be careful. They must avoid assuming the worst too quickly. They must continue searching for medical explanations. But they must also recognize when repeated events begin to suggest something unusual. That balance became increasingly important at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital. The concerns developing among staff were not based on one isolated incident. They emerged from repeated observations and a growing awareness that the number and nature of certain medical emergencies appeared difficult to explain through ordinary circumstances alone. At first, discussions remained within the medical environment. Staff reviewed cases. They considered possible explanations. They looked at whether there were common medical factors shared between patients. This was a process of analysis, not accusation. The responsibility of healthcare professionals is first to care for patients, and any investigation must be approached with fairness and evidence. A suspicion without proof is not a conclusion. A concern must be examined carefully before it can become an established fact. That careful approach is one of the reasons investigations involving healthcare settings can be complicated. Hospitals are places where serious illness naturally occurs. Children admitted to pediatric wards are already vulnerable. Medical emergencies, unfortunately, are part of hospital life. The challenge is identifying when something has moved beyond expected medical uncertainty. As hospital staff continued examining the situation, attention began focusing more closely on patterns. Investigators and medical professionals later considered factors such as timing, circumstances, and available records to understand whether the events shared meaningful connections. The importance of timing would become a central element of the investigation. In any complex case, reconstructing events requires understanding not only what happened, but also when it happened, who was present, and what information was available at each stage. Time creates the framework for understanding. A moment that seems ordinary when it occurs can become significant when viewed alongside other events. A routine shift can later become part of a larger timeline. A conversation that seemed unimportant can later provide valuable context. This is why investigations often require patience. Truth is not always revealed through a single piece of evidence. More often, it emerges through careful examination of many small details. For the families involved, this process was happening far away from their immediate concerns. They were not looking at timelines or patterns. They were experiencing each moment personally. They were waiting for updates. They were trying to understand medical explanations. They were hoping for improvement. The emotional distance between those two perspectives, the investigative view and the family experience, is important to recognize. Investigators look for connections. Families live through consequences. Both perspectives are part of understanding what happened. As concerns became more serious, the hospital environment entered a difficult period. Staff members had to continue providing care while confronting questions that challenged assumptions they had long held about their workplace. A hospital depends on teamwork. Trust between colleagues is essential. When concerns emerge about safety, those relationships can become complicated. People must balance professional responsibility with the need to avoid unfair conclusions. The events at Grantham demonstrated the importance of having systems that allow concerns to be examined objectively. When something appears unusual, there must be a process for reviewing information, seeking expert opinions, and determining the appropriate response. Those principles extend beyond this particular case. They are part of modern approaches to patient safety worldwide. The questions raised during this period would eventually lead to a much broader investigation. Medical information would be reviewed. Experts would analyze evidence. Authorities would become involved. The focus would shift from understanding unusual medical events to determining whether criminal actions had occurred. But that transition did not happen instantly. It began with observation. It began with professionals paying attention. It began with people being willing to ask a difficult question. What if these events were connected? That question represented a turning point. Because once that possibility was considered, the events at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital could no longer be viewed only as separate medical emergencies. They had become part of a larger search for answers. A search that would eventually involve one of the most significant investigations into a healthcare worker in modern British legal history. The transition from concern to investigation is one of the most difficult moments for any institution. It requires people to move from uncertainty toward action. At Grantham and Kesteven Hospital, The situation that had initially been approached as a series of medical difficulties gradually began to demand a different kind of attention. The question was no longer only about why individual patients had become seriously unwell. It became a broader question about whether there was a connection between events that had previously been considered separately. This kind of realization rarely happens suddenly. It develops through conversations. A doctor may remember a detail from a previous case. A nurse may notice similarities between situations. A review of records may reveal something that was not obvious at the time. Each observation adds another piece to a picture that is still incomplete. For professionals working within healthcare, this stage carries a heavy responsibility. Raising concerns about a colleague is never a simple decision. Medical environments depend on cooperation and trust, and an accusation involving a healthcare worker carries serious consequences. That is why proper procedures are essential. Concerns must be examined carefully. Evidence must be reviewed objectively. Conclusions must be based on facts rather than assumptions. The goal is not to create suspicion where none exists. The goal is to protect patients while ensuring fairness for everyone involved. As attention focused more closely on the unusual events occurring within the pediatric ward, information that had previously existed only in separate records began to receive greater examination. Patient histories, treatment details, and timelines became important sources of information. Investigators looking back at a complex case must reconstruct events as accurately as possible. They ask questions such as, what happened? When did it happen? Who was present? What information was available at the time? What explanations were considered? These questions form the foundation of any serious investigation. The process is often slow because accuracy matters. A mistake in interpretation can affect innocent people, while a failure to recognize genuine danger can place others at risk. The responsibility is enormous. During this period, the hospital community faced an uncomfortable reality. The environment that had always represented safety was now the subject of intense examination. For staff members, this created an emotional and professional challenge. They continued caring for patients while also confronting uncertainty about events within their own workplace. For families, the uncertainty was deeply personal. They wanted answers. They wanted to understand what had happened to their children. They wanted reassurance that lessons would be learned. The wider public would later struggle with similar questions. How could unusual events occur within a healthcare setting without being immediately recognized? What safeguards were available? How should concerns be handled when they involve someone working in a position of trust? These questions would become central themes in discussions about patient safety after the case. One important lesson from investigations of this nature is that complex systems rely on communication. Information must move between individuals and departments. Concerns must have a clear path for review. Staff members must know that raising questions is part of their responsibility, not a failure of loyalty. Healthcare depends on compassion, but it also depends on accountability. The two principles are not opposites. They exist together. The events at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital eventually moved beyond internal concern and into a formal criminal investigation. This marked a significant change. The focus shifted from exploring possible medical explanations to examining evidence under legal standards. Medical professionals and law enforcement operate differently. Doctors seek diagnoses. Investigators seek evidence. Courts determine responsibility based on proof presented according to legal rules. Bringing these different processes together requires careful cooperation. The investigation that followed would involve detailed examination of medical information, professional testimony, and evidence gathered over time. Each step would contribute to a clearer understanding of what had occurred. But before there were courtroom proceedings and public attention, there was a quieter stage that often receives less recognition. The stage where people noticed something was wrong. The stage where difficult questions were asked. The stage where individuals chose not to ignore uncertainty. Many investigations begin this way, not with certainty, but with someone deciding that a concern deserves attention. In the history of the Grantham case, that decision became a defining moment. The discovery phase of an investigation is rarely defined by one dramatic moment. More often, it begins with a collection of questions that refuse to disappear. At Grantham and Kesteven Hospital, the concerns that had developed among medical staff gradually moved into a more formal process of examination. What had initially been a matter of clinical uncertainty became a situation requiring a deeper review of available information. The first task was understanding the facts. Investigators and medical professionals needed to establish a clear timeline. They needed to examine what had happened, when events occurred, and what circumstances surrounded each case. In any investigation involving a healthcare environment, records become extremely important because they provide a detailed account of patient care. Medical documentation is created for many reasons. It allows healthcare workers to communicate with one another. It helps guide treatment decisions. It creates a record of a patient's condition and response to care. Later, those same records can become essential in understanding events after they have occurred. Looking back through medical information requires careful attention. Investigators must avoid viewing the past only through the knowledge they have gained later. They must consider what was known at each moment and what explanations were reasonable at the time. This distinction matters. Hindsight can make patterns appear obvious, but real-time decision-making is far more complicated. During the review of events connected to the pediatric ward, investigators examined available information to determine whether the incidents shared common characteristics. They considered medical details, timing, circumstances, and other evidence that could help explain why certain emergencies had occurred. The process required patience. Complex investigations are built through accumulation. A single piece of information may not provide an answer. A single observation may not prove a conclusion. But when multiple independent pieces of evidence point in the same direction, they can create a clearer picture. This approach is fundamental to both medical analysis and criminal investigation. Evidence must be tested. Assumptions must be questioned. Alternative explanations must be considered. The goal is not simply to confirm an existing belief, but to discover what the facts truly show. As attention increased, the case moved into a new stage. The involvement of law enforcement introduced additional methods of examination. Investigators began working alongside medical specialists to understand the available evidence and determine whether criminal activity had taken place. This cooperation between medicine and law enforcement is complex because the two fields approach problems differently. Healthcare professionals are trained to treat and understand illness. Police investigators are trained to establish facts related to possible crimes. Both require careful observation, but their objectives are different. Bringing these perspectives together was essential. The investigators needed medical knowledge to understand the significance of certain findings. Medical experts needed investigative information to understand the broader context surrounding those findings. Slowly, the picture became clearer. The case was no longer only about unexplained medical emergencies. It had become an examination of responsibility, trust, and whether a healthcare environment had been misused. For the families involved, this period represented another stage of uncertainty. An investigation may provide the possibility of answers, but it also requires families to revisit painful experiences. They must wait while professionals examine evidence and follow legal procedures. The process can feel slow, especially for those seeking clarity about events that have already changed their lives. Justice systems operate carefully because the consequences are serious. A conclusion must be supported by evidence. A person accused of a crime has legal rights. Victims and families have the right to have their experiences taken seriously. Maintaining all of these principles is essential. The investigation into the events at Grantham would eventually become one of the most significant cases involving a healthcare worker in Britain. But before it reached a courtroom, it was shaped by the quiet work of reviewing information, comparing details, and asking questions that had previously remained unanswered. The discovery phase was not about one single revelation. It was about persistence. It was about professionals being willing to examine uncomfortable possibilities. And it was about recognizing that protecting vulnerable patients sometimes requires looking beyond the explanations that initially seem most likely. Every major investigation begins with someone noticing that something does not fit. In Grantham, that process began with medical professionals who recognized that the unusual events surrounding the pediatric ward required closer attention. The search for answers had moved from uncertainty toward evidence. And the next challenge would be determining what that evidence meant. Investigations are often described through their final conclusions, but the path toward those conclusions is usually much slower and more uncertain. Behind every major case are countless hours spent reviewing information that, at first glance, may appear ordinary. Documents must be examined. Timelines must be reconstructed. Statements must be compared. Specialists must interpret evidence that often requires years of professional experience to understand. The investigation connected to Grantham and Kesteven Hospital followed this same careful process. Once concerns had moved beyond informal discussion and into official review, investigators faced a difficult task: understanding a series of events that had occurred within a complex medical environment. Hospitals generate enormous amounts of information. Patient notes, medication records, laboratory results, staff schedules, clinical observations. Each piece exists for a practical purpose during patient care, but during an investigation, these separate records become part of a larger effort to reconstruct what happened. The challenge is that records do not explain themselves. A document may show that something occurred, but investigators must determine what that information means within the wider context. A medical result must be interpreted by specialists. A timeline must be compared against other available information. A statement must be considered alongside physical evidence and professional analysis. This is why complex investigations require cooperation between different fields. Police investigators bring experience in collecting and organizing evidence. Medical experts provide knowledge about clinical possibilities. Legal professionals ensure that procedures are followed fairly. Each perspective contributes something essential. As the review continued, investigators focused on identifying connections between individual events. The purpose was not simply to collect information, but to understand whether there was a consistent pattern that could explain what had happened. Patterns are powerful because they transform isolated events into a larger picture. However, recognizing a pattern requires caution. Humans naturally look for connections, even when none exist. That is why professional investigations must rely on evidence rather than intuition alone. A suspicion may begin an investigation, but evidence must determine the outcome. This principle became especially important in a case involving a healthcare professional. The position itself carried a level of trust and responsibility. Any conclusion would have significant consequences, not only for the individual involved but also for the medical community and public confidence in healthcare institutions. For that reason, investigators had to proceed carefully. Every finding needed to be examined. Every possibility needed to be considered. Every conclusion needed to be supported. The scientific elements of the investigation were particularly important. Medical evidence can be complex because the human body is affected by many variables. Experts must consider natural illness, treatment effects, and other possible explanations before reaching conclusions. This process reflects the standards of both medicine and law. A serious conclusion requires careful reasoning. As the investigation progressed, the picture surrounding the pediatric ward became increasingly detailed. Information that had previously existed separately was examined together. The focus shifted from individual incidents toward understanding the broader circumstances surrounding them. For families waiting for answers, this period was emotionally difficult. Investigations move according to evidence and procedure, not according to the emotional urgency felt by those affected. While investigators may spend months or years building a case, families experience each day as part of an ongoing personal reality. They are not waiting for a historical conclusion. They are living with the consequences. This difference is one of the most challenging aspects of major investigations. The public often sees only the final stages: arrests, trials, and verdicts. Less visible are the months of careful work that make those moments possible. The examination of the Grantham cases required exactly that kind of work. It required professionals to remain focused despite uncertainty. It required them to separate facts from assumptions. And it required them to examine a situation that challenged one of the strongest foundations of healthcare: trust. The investigation also raised broader questions about institutional responsibility. When unusual events occur within any organization, the response depends on communication. Information must reach the people who have the authority and expertise to act. Concerns must not disappear simply because they are difficult or uncomfortable. These lessons would later influence discussions about safeguarding and patient protection. The goal of improved systems is not to create an atmosphere of constant suspicion. It is to create an environment where concerns can be identified, examined, and addressed before greater harm occurs. As investigators continued their work, the case moved closer toward a decisive stage. The evidence gathered would eventually need to be presented in a legal setting, where it could be tested through examination and challenge. But before a courtroom could determine responsibility, investigators first had to complete the difficult task of building a clear and reliable account of events. The discovery phase was therefore not a single moment of revelation. It was a process. A process built on records, expertise, persistence, and the willingness to examine uncomfortable questions. And with each piece of evidence reviewed, the investigation moved closer to understanding what had happened inside the pediatric ward of Grantham and Kesteven Hospital. It represented the point where a series of troubling events began to be viewed not simply as unfortunate medical outcomes, but as a situation requiring deeper examination. The search for answers had begun. And as investigators continued their work, the next challenge would be determining exactly what the evidence revealed, separating facts from assumptions, and understanding how events inside a trusted medical environment had reached this point. In any investigation involving a medical setting, evidence must be approached with extraordinary care. The human body is complex. Illness can develop unexpectedly. Treatments can have different effects on different patients. A medical emergency may have many possible explanations, and determining the difference between a natural event and an intentional act requires expertise, patience, and a commitment to facts. This was the challenge facing investigators examining the events connected to Grantham and Kesteven Hospital. The task was not simply to identify what had happened. The task was to understand why it had happened. That meant looking beyond individual incidents and examining the wider circumstances surrounding them. Investigators needed to understand whether the events represented a series of unrelated medical emergencies or whether there was a connection that required further explanation. The answer would come through careful analysis. Medical specialists examined information from the affected cases. Investigators reviewed available documentation. Every detail was considered within its proper context. This process demonstrated an important principle of forensic work: evidence does not speak on its own. Evidence must be interpreted. A laboratory result requires expert understanding. A timeline requires careful reconstruction. A witness statement requires consideration of memory, perspective, and surrounding circumstances. Only by bringing different sources of information together can investigators create a reliable picture. As the review continued, attention focused on details that could help explain the unusual medical events. Information that once appeared to belong only to individual cases began to be considered as part of a larger investigation. This shift is one of the defining moments in many complex cases. At the beginning, investigators ask, "What happened to this person?" Later, they must ask, "Is there something connecting these events?" The difference between those questions represents the movement from individual examination toward pattern analysis. For the families involved, this process represented a search for answers that had emotional importance far beyond the investigation itself. They were not interested only in procedures or evidence. They wanted to understand what had happened and why their children had suffered. The justice system, however, requires a careful path toward those answers. Strong emotions may explain why a case matters, but they cannot replace evidence. Suspicions may explain why an investigation begins, but they cannot replace proof. This principle protects everyone involved and ensures that conclusions are reached through reliable methods. As investigators gathered information, the case began attracting wider attention. The possibility that events within a trusted medical environment might involve criminal responsibility raised serious concerns throughout Britain. Hospitals are places where people expect protection. They are environments built around care, expertise, and responsibility. When a case challenges that expectation, society naturally asks difficult questions. How can vulnerable patients be protected? How should concerns be reported? What systems are needed to recognize unusual patterns? These questions extended beyond one hospital and one investigation. They became part of a broader conversation about patient safety. The importance of these discussions lies in prevention. Learning from a tragedy is not about creating fear around healthcare. It is about strengthening the structures that allow healthcare professionals to provide safe and effective care. Every hospital depends on trust. But trust works best when supported by accountability. During the investigation, professionals had to navigate a difficult balance. They needed to examine serious concerns while maintaining the fairness required in any criminal process. This meant allowing evidence to guide decisions rather than allowing assumptions to determine conclusions. That approach would eventually lead the case toward a formal legal process. But before that stage, investigators needed to complete one of the most demanding parts of their work, transforming a collection of separate events into a coherent account supported by evidence. This required time. It required expertise. And it required persistence. The discovery phase of the investigation was therefore not defined by a single dramatic moment. Instead, it was shaped by hundreds of smaller actions, reviewing records, consulting specialists, examining timelines, and asking difficult questions. Each step brought investigators closer to understanding the reality behind the events at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital. The hospital that had once been known primarily as a place of treatment had become the center of a national discussion about trust and responsibility. And as the evidence continued to be examined, the investigation approached the moment when questions would move from possibility toward formal accusation, and when the findings would be tested in a court of law.